Cassandra, the vintage arcade gal here, with a new game and our arcade we want to talk about. In the early 80s, there was an interesting problem arising where operators felt the games were just too expensive to buy brand new full-size arcade games with every title. And the arcade market was suffering somewhat financially thanks to the video game crash of '83. So there was a big push to create new games that were easier for operators to change, more cost-effective also to change over to new titles. And Nintendo, who had become kind of the cream of the crop all of a sudden for the home user, decided they also wanted to create a system that would allow them to utilize their popular home titles in the arcade setting. And they actually created two of these systems. And the system we're going to talk about today is the Unisystem, which is also sometimes referred to as the Versus system, or sometimes people just refer to it by the title of the game itself. This is a unique and important system historically with arcade games, and we're going to walk you through the process of the restoration of this particular one, and also just in general, what brought the market to this point. In 1983, the video game industry was already in serious trouble. Despite being such a young industry, the market had become saturated with too many products, poor quality products, and a price war between home video game systems and entry-level home computers. In an attempt by companies to cash in on the hot market of video games, customers were getting burned by too many choices and often disappointing products. Even the industry leader Atari was making poor decisions, from terrible home versions of beloved games such as Pac-Man to a poorly thought out Atari 5200 system, which was an attempt to compete with the onslaught of newer and more powerful systems. Thanks to a price war started by the home computer companies Commodore and Texas Instruments, soon stores were full of bargain bins of software and video game systems. There were just too many products on the market, and too much of the product was simply not very good. New products from many companies would be canceled, eventually leading to whole lines being canceled in an attempt to save parent companies from losing millions. Once huge industry leaders such as Coleco and Mattel Electronics closed shop, never to return to the video game market again. The industry leader, Atari, attempted to course correct their disastrous Atari 5200 failure with the innovative Atari 7800 system. The 7800 system allowed arcade quality experiences at home and out-of-the-box Atari 2600 compatibility. Gone were the terrible 5200 system joysticks, and Atari even had plans to turn the 7800 into an expandable computer system in an attempt to compete with the low-cost home computers such as the Commodore 64. Unfortunately for Atari, the burden of their huge unprofitable streak thanks to the video game crash was just too much for the parent company, Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers would go ahead and divide the company up into two companies and sell it off, Atari Games and Atari Corporation. Now, Atari Games would continue to make arcade games for the next 20 to 25 plus years, including games like Gauntlet, Marble Madness, and even the Rush Racing series, where Atari Corporation would more concentrate on home computers, such as this beautiful Atari ST computer. Now, Atari would eventually release the 7800 and get back into home video game systems, but by then it was a little too late. They were no longer the industry standard or leader and never would be again. That would go to a new upstart in the industry that seemingly came out of nowhere. In 1985, Nintendo of Japan saw an opportunity in the North American market for their family computer video game system. Nintendo was most known for their arcade game Donkey Kong in North America. Initially, they went to Atari to strike a distribution deal for the new system. And when Atari turned them down, they decided to strike it on their own and would rename the family computer system the Nintendo Entertainment System. The Nintendo Entertainment System would go on to be a huge success and a cultural pop phenomenon, proving that video games, and more specifically home video game systems, were not just a trend like the pet rock that people wanted to play home video games
and they wanted them to be of substantial quality. Nintendo at that point focused their attention back on the arcade. Thanks to the overwhelming success of the Nintendo Entertainment System, Nintendo decided to offer these games as the Unisystem, a system that the games could easily be switched in and out for the owner and operator. Now, most of these games were sold as conversion kits for older Nintendo titles such as Donkey Kong and Popeye, but there were dedicated units from the factory as well. Initial titles were very similar to the first few dozen titles for the NES system, including games like Hogan's Alley or Baseball or Super Mario Brothers. Now, there was also a dual screen version of the Unisystem available, both as this huge dedicated upright version and a cocktail variant, sometimes known as the red tint. This dual monitor version not only allowed 4 players to play, but could either play the same game on both screens with all 4 players or 2 totally separate games on each screen. Now, this is achieved rather interestingly through just one CPU. The top and the bottom portion of the CPU allows either to have the same game program running for some games or 2 totally different game programs at once. So like if you wanted to have Hogan's Alley on one side and Super Mario Brothers on the other, it would require those ROM chips and processors on the top compared to the bottom. If you wanted the game to have a 4-player game, such as like versus tennis, all the top and the bottom ROM sockets and processor points would have to have the tennis and the correct tennis ROMs and processors in those slots, allowing for 4 people to play up to at a time on 2 different screens at once, which was pretty interesting. Now, as the Unisystem aged and kind of went on, fewer and fewer games actually made their way to the Unisystem compared to the Play Toys that seemed to have a much better selection of newer titles. So as later NES games such as like Rad Racer came out or Captain Skyhawk, you never really saw those games on the Unisystem. Although probably the last game available would be the puzzle game Dr. Mario.
Alright, so if you were an owner or operator of one of these Unisystem titles back in the day and you wanted to change your game to a newer title or a more popular title, you would have purchased one of these from a Nintendo distributor. And this is a versus pack system. They were relatively inexpensive, about $300 to $500 for one of these, depending upon the title. And they were very, very easy to install. All you did was open one of these up, and mine's a little broken, so we're just going to pretend that that's connected. And you found all sorts of great stuff in here to change your game. The most important thing you found were the ROMs, and these go on that Unisystem board. Not only do you get a ROM, but you also get a processor, and you get what's called a PPU chip. Now, the PPU is important because it chooses what colors the game uses, pulling from the palette of available colors of that particular game. PPUs are game specific, but some games use the same PPU as other games. Now, you can put the wrong PPU in intentionally if you desire, or if you don't happen to have the right PPU for that game, but the colors will usually be totally incorrect, and sometimes they won't work at all. Now, the other thing you got was you got a new piece of glass for your marquee, and you also would receive a Mylar, a clear, translucent Mylar that would go behind and light up on the marquee announcing the new game. Unfortunately, I don't have the marquee Mylar that belongs to this game, so we'll just pretend that we have it. Sometimes you would also get a cardboard standee that would go on top of the game announcing the game as well. Since these were cardboard, they're a little more difficult to track down. Obviously, things like that don't tend to survive as well. I'm hoping that somebody eventually starts to make reproductions of those. You also got a couple other wacky things. You got a new cardboard surround for the monitor to cover up some of the screw edges around the monitor. You also got instructions for the cocktail version of the game that goes underneath a little piece of plexiglass to the right of the monitor on those red tint cocktail versions. You received instructions of the game for the operator, the person installing. It shows you where to put it on the board and the dip switch settings. There's a sticker that you put in the cabinet about the dip switches to remind the operator, I guess if you want to make it more difficult or make it more expensive. And some random stickers and doodads, including the license sticker that goes on top of the cabinet. You also got this center sticker that goes in between the middle of the two control panels on the two-up connected version of the dedicated cabinet. And that was it. So obviously this was a very affordable way for somebody to change the game. Very easy. You can easily change this out in 15 minutes, if not shorter. So here it is in all of its glory, the Unisystem Super Mario Bros. Fully restored. Let's take a little bit of a closer look at what it's all about.
Like a lot of games, we picked this one up off of Craigslist, and it was dirty but complete and non-working, and it had the golf package in it at the time. Cabinet overall was in decent shape physically. No water damage, no massive structural damage. It had some issues at the front and the base, like a lot of these games do. These Nintendo cabinets weren't really designed to take the pounding that American audiences probably subjected them to. Here you can see the original serial plate for the Donkey Kong cabinet, which it originally was, a Donkey Kong. And somewhere it got converted maybe to several things, we don't know, but by the time we got it, it was this Unisystem. Control panel, the left joystick was non-functional, some of the buttons were non-original, and the overlay was torn. At some point it was indeed a Mario Brothers. We found this meter receipt inside from the operator that clearly shows it was a Mario at some point in its life. The current counter is above 70,000, so this would have been a while ago before they turned it into a golf game. At the time, we had quite a few projects in the workshop, so we did end up getting the Crystal Castles, the Rally X, and we ended up putting the Moon Patrol upstairs before we started working on this. As you can see, the sides were covered in black vinyl, which is always better than paint, so we took all that off, as you'll see in a second. The first idea to get it working was to check out the power supply. You always want to check power first and work your way up when restoring a game. After deeming it not rebuildable, I put a switching power supply in there and we started working on the monitor. The monitor is a 20 Sanyo EZ monitor, pretty typical of Nintendo games. The B voltage section had totally exploded, and you can see here we tried to recap it and try to refix it, and it was just a no-go. Here's one of the ceramic, I guess that's a resistor, transistor, and it just totally went kablooey. So luckily for us, we had a couple different chassis from other 20EZs we had worked on. I had a totally rebuilt chassis that was connected to a bad tube. And we had a tube from the Donkey Kong Jr. game, which the tube itself no longer had almost any sense of green, and no matter what we did, we couldn't quite get it to work. So we set apart taking the good chassis from the one in the bad tube and putting that chassis on what we were hoping was the good tube of the Unisystem game. And here we have the amplifier section. You have to be really careful to label these parts because the plugs are very similar. If you plug the wrong one into the wrong thing, it's not going to be a good day for you. Here we have the two different monitors. We have the good chassis with the bad tube, and the bad chassis with what we hoped was going to be the good tube. And in fact, voila, we have a working game. And you can see how terrible those colors are on the bad tube. You really have to crank it to get any sense of green, and it just makes everything off-putting and looking very strange and very weak. It's not even a true green. It's like a dirt green. I don't even know how to describe it. So once we put the good tube and the good chassis together, voila, it looks great. But it is golf, unfortunately. And this golf guy kind of looks like a fat Mario who's retired to Florida, maybe. And so there you go. It was working. The board was working. It sounded great. And now we could focus more of our attention on the physical attributes of the game itself. And we put the monitor back in, and we started the process of cleaning the game up. At this point, we turned our attention to the actual cabinet itself. Structurally, it was in decent condition. There was a little repair work that we did to the front underneath the control panel as well as the base of the game itself. We stripped off this thick, kind of nasty black vinyl sticker stuff they put on there and attempted to patch the nastier spots in the game. You can see there's quite a bit of damage on the front bottom there, probably where people kicked it. At that point, we sanded it down the best we could. And you have a couple options here. Now, you could re-laminate the cabinet if you're feeling saucy, but some of these cabinets were actually painted laminate, not colored laminate. So you use an oil-based paint here, and we had a pretty good color match from Sherwin-Williams. It's got a metallic flake in it too that gives it a little shine. And then you use a foam roller using what's called a dry painting technique. And it just takes some patience along with a couple rounds of sanding. We used an orbital sander and we started getting some really nice results. You can see there too, we also repainted the inside black, the base, and the top as well to give it more of a finish. And there you can see the bottom pretty well. And it started looking great. And even though the color doesn't quite do it justice here on some of these photos because the lighting's kind of awkward, it was a perfect match for the Donkey Kong blue. That's a much better shot there. You can see that Donkey Kong blue has a very specific kind of hue to it, and it started to look great. So the old control panel was pretty gross, and so we took off all the joysticks and all the buttons and labeled everything, and then proceeded to clean out the joysticks completely. And they worked great. Didn't need any new parts. We did get new button tops though, since the old buttons were pretty worn. Then you have to scrape off and sand down the old control panel, which takes a while. It's not a thrilling job, but necessary, and you want to make sure you do a great job here getting all that off. You can still see some of the graphic there from the original before I got all the goop off there, but you want to get this as clean and smooth as possible for a much better application of the new overlay. Makes a big difference. You also want to make sure you measure out, as you can see there, to make sure your new control panel is going to line up properly as the old one. I actually sometimes will make a paper template of the control panel to line it up, and then there you go. New buttons, rebuilt joysticks, cleaning out the shafts of the joysticks, like in one of the other videos you can watch how we do that, and it looked so much better. Looks clean as a bell. Joysticks are very responsive, and it's ready to play whatever game you want to play in it. Next up is the restoration of the coin door, which I've always very surprised that people don't take more of an effort to make the coin doors not only look good in their classic games, but also make them function. I like all my games to operate on quarters. So, you take it apart, and the Nintendo coin doors are pretty simple. The coin mechanism in return is all in one unit, and what you can do is just kind of take these things apart and buff the pieces individually if they're all dinged up and scratched up like you see here. And some fine-grained sandpaper, some patience. Wow, look at that. What a difference. You don't have the marks anymore. Looks a lot better. Next, we totally stripped down the rusty coin door mech itself down to bare metal using our orbital sander, and then going over it with a little bit more of a fine-tooth comb, and then we just paint it with some nice semi-gloss paint. Some people like to powder coat these things. I don't bother. Maybe one day I'll get fancy and take it powder coated, which is admittedly very nice looking. And you see inside outside, it's all clean, all ready to go, and fully functional, working on quarters. Next up is the exciting final process. It's the reassembly of all the pieces. So put our coin door back in place with the original bolts there. You can see brand new shiny lock as well. The original lock was totally broken. Then we do a test to make sure all of our wiring works. Put our control panel back on, and you can see our Mario game is playing. Our marquee is in place as well, all pretty and lit up as it should be. And at that point, what we did was we had taken off the casters that are on the bottom of the game to clean them up. So we reassemble those, tilting the game forward slightly to do it. This is kind of a pain in the neck to do, and sometimes these bolts get stripped on these games, so you may have to do some drilling. Luckily, we were able to fix this. Hey, and then we put the side art on, and a lot of people have some techniques for doing this. There's the wet technique, which I would recommend checking out if you do. This requires patience and time, and I would say you definitely need a heat gun to pull this off right. and a lot of planning, making sure you're doing it right. Then you have T-molding goes on. This is the white Nintendo T-molding that you traditionally see, although the original T-molding for the Unisystem would have been black and not white. And there we go. It's all assembled with the side art on, marquee on, and the new bezel, which is not the most exciting bezel in the world. Some people like to put custom art on these things. I prefer my games to be a little more authentic to what they should have been, even though this is technically a restoration or conversion. There you go. My wife is very happy, and we are in the process here of taking it upstairs around the house to the game room. And these games just look so great next to other Nintendo games, and their bright colors. Here it is next to our restored Donkey Kong Jr., and maybe one day we'll get a red one and Red Donkey Kong or Donkey Kong 3 or something to put next to it. That would look really sharp.
Hi there. So we're going to peek inside the game here, and I'll show you what we have going on. Now these are the Unisystem boards, and normally there's a filter board that sits over top of this as well, but I've taken that off so we can easily change these games. I have two CPUs in here right now. Right now this is the Mario board, and this is the Castlevania board. You could probably fit up to 3 in here, but the Castlevania board, I'm going to take it out here for a second, has this special daughter card, which makes it a little fatter and it's harder to fit. This was originally designed to prevent piracy of Konami games. The only other game that I think uses this daughter card is Top Gun, which is also a Konami title. So these just slide in here. This was all part of the original kit. And then, of course, you got new wiring to modify the game from the original Donkey Kong wiring into the Versus game. I've put a new power supply in here. I probably could have rebuilt the Nintendo one, but I just couldn't quite get it to work to my satisfaction. The original isolation transformer is original. And over here, I've installed a third board, which is Excitebike. Eventually, I'll put a switcher in here from Vector Labs so I won't have to pull the wiring harness out and plug the new board back in when I want to change games. Okay, so like we talked about before with the kit, you have your marquee, which would change for each game, and you have a bezel. Now, some of the Unisystem games, when they were converted from the original Donkey Kong or Donkey Kong Jr., what you find is the bezel, like this one here, would just be flipped around backwards, and you would just see the black outline from the back of the game. This one has the dedicated Versus, which is just a simple black square that blacks out the edges of the screen under a smoked piece of plexiglass. You have a control panel. This would have been new with the Unisystem conversion. It's a metal control panel, as you saw probably in the restoration part of the video, and this layout should be very familiar to you if you are an NES fan. An A and a B button, 1 player, 2 player start. Now, the dedicated versions that were doubles would have 1, 2, 3, 4 player start in the center instead of just 1, 2. And of course, the cocktails are also just a little bit different. This is an 8-way control stick. These are pretty good joysticks, pretty easily repairable. And then the rest of it is just a simple Donkey Kong cabinet. I mean, nothing has really been changed to this at all. Typical standard coin door you find in all these Nintendo games. The dedicating unit was slightly different. Single speaker output, like a lot of these games. And if you look on the side here with the side art, I've noticed there's 2 variations of this kind of Versus art. There's this more silver gray version that you see here, and a more vivid black, orange, and purple version. I'm not sure which one came with which game. I've seen both versions on both the dedicated and converted games. We kind of like this version better. This came from Rich of This Old Game. He does wonderful reproductions, and it just looks great. I think that the lighter colors kind of suit the game a little bit better. Now, unlike the Play Choice, whose games are exactly more or less the same gameplay-wise as their NES counterparts, the Unisystem games tend to be a little different. For example, Super Mario Brothers here is slightly more difficult, doesn't contain exactly the same warp cheats, and even has some levels that are not included in the original game. Castlevania for the Unisystem is actually much more difficult than its home version companion. And a game like Excitebike has qualifying levels and even bonus stages that are not seen in the original NES version of the game. Probably the most famous version that has a difference is the game Duck Hunt, where you can actually shoot the dog if you so desire. Now, the Unisystem would not be the first or the last system to try to use this kind of easy to change game philosophy. Even Nintendo would go on after the play choice to make a game system called the Super System that integrated Super Nintendo titles in a very similar fashion. Of course, behind me I have a Neo Geo, which one could argue is maybe the most successful system of this style of easy to change games for the owner and operator. There's a funny story here too regarding the Unisystem and these kind of games. Now, this is not the first Unisystem I've actually owned. I owned one way back in the early 90s. I purchased at a vending machine auction. And at the time, these games were practically worthless to owner operators. I bought a beautiful red tint, dual-sided, dedicated cocktail for around $40. That's right, $40. And I remember going to an auction specifically that had a whole bunch of Unisystem uprights. They couldn't even give away. Somebody ended up buying a whole bunch of them for $5. It's $5. And I think a couple of them were even working and totally serviceable. There just wasn't any real want or desire to have these games as collectibles back then. But now the Unisystem is somewhat lauded and respected and is a very important part of video game arcade history, and I'm glad to have it in our collection. It looks great, it plays great. I love Castlevania. In fact, Castlevania is probably my favorite game out of all the Unisystem games. Probably because I'm so terrible at Super Mario, but there you go. We have some new projects coming up. I've got a Simpsons I'm restoring. I have a special game that I won't spoil, even though I probably already have in some other videos, and also an elevator action cocktail that's pretty rare. So with summer coming up, hopefully we'll get some of these projects done, and who knows, we may find some new exciting projects. So until then, happy hunting, and I'm gonna start playing some Castlevania here.